Hello and welcome. My name is Justin Smith. I work on security at Pivotal, and I wanted to talk about a few basic ideas on cloud native security. I've given this talk before. I've also written a lot of this content. I think the feedback from the first time I did it to now is the ideas that we're going to present here, I think, present a new way to think about security in the data center. And I'll go into specifics here, and I'll go into a few stories. I'll try to leave 5 minutes at the end for everybody to ask questions or hurl personal attacks at me if that's what you like to do. You can also find me on Twitter. There's my handle up there. Other than that, let's get started. So I'll start with a Spice Girl quote. I'll tell you what I want, what I really, really want. In my career, I'm hopeful that I can somehow affect change that's positive in computing. That's kind of why I joined Pivotal. That's what my aim has been in my career ever since I started. I've been in cloud infrastructure security for 10 years. It feels like longer than that. In Silicon Valley years, that's eons. But I've been focused exclusively on this area for 10 years and been in enterprise computing and security for a little bit longer than that. But I assert that the world today in enterprise security is in a very strange place. Anybody raise their hand that thinks they have security under control in their organization? I've never seen anybody answer yes to that question. Doesn't matter at what point in my career I asked it, but today, I think it's especially worse than it was, say, 10 years ago, right? I assert and I believe that the threat landscape today moves faster than it's ever moved before. And I think the tools that we have to bring to bear inside the data center move slower than they've ever moved before, and that's why you need new technologies. So primarily, I'm going to be focusing on Cloud Foundry here, but I'm not trying to sell you Cloud Foundry. I'm really trying to sell you an idea. And the idea is that the status quo of security in the enterprise is completely broken and it will not work. The bets that organizations are making today are not working, and it's because the software community has shipped bad tools for decades. It is not the fault of the enterprises that things move slowly. I assert that it's the fault of software vendors that things move slowly, and that's why the threat landscape is so upside down and underwater and on fire, right? And I believe that Cloud Foundry is one of the technologies that can change that, but if you were to go out and evaluate a cloud technology, I think the framework that we're going to talk about here is a reasonable one to use as a gauge to say, am I actually improving security or is it getting worse? And I really don't care about incremental change. I want dramatic quantum leaps, right? Because I think that's what's needed today in the organization. I can get excited about this stuff. Sorry, I hope it's not too weird. So I've gotten into arguments with various people at other organizations and other software vendors saying, well, what you're preaching here is not actually a universal solution to the security problems that organizations face today. And I was like, of course not. What we're going to talk about today, I assert, is one of the things that moves the ball forward, that gives you a better security posture and allows you to focus on a lot of other important stuff. You can think less about malware in the data center. You can think less about advanced persistent threats. You can think less about leaked credentials. And you can focus on other areas. So I don't assert that anything I'm talking about inside this conversation, this 20, 30-minute conversation, is going to make the world all cupcakes, unicorns, and rainbows. It's not, right? But what I do want to change is this face. When you go talk to an organization's security team today, and you talk about moving to the cloud, or you talk about just staying where they are, there's kind of a look of fear, right? If your job is to protect an organization like a big enterprise, if you're the CISO or you're on the security team, it's an extraordinarily difficult job to have, right? It's an extremely hard thing to do, and it's one of the things you'll be not sleeping very well. I don't sleep very well, unfortunately, right? The software that Pivotal ships is used in a large number of enterprises. And so the amplification effect for Pivotal from a security point of view is tremendous. And that's one of the things I obsess about late at night at 3 o'clock in the morning. But this is a face that I want to change, and I think we can change. There's a conference going on right now at another venue in Las Vegas that's primarily focused on security, right? And if you go look at the content of what's there, there's some really interesting talks, right? There's talks about how you can go look at wireless networks, how you can go evaluate the security of an iOS app. There's some pretty interesting crypto talks, but there's a lot of stuff on threat intelligence and monitoring. So the idea is the state of the art in the organization today is to use deep neural networks and artificial intelligence to monitor artifacts of a data center to try to detect anomalous behavior. That's it. My assertion is increments in that world are complete failures. You might as well try to stop a freight train with a tennis ball, right? Because by the time an attack has happened and the time you can detect it, it's a little bit too late, right? Finding a vulnerability is very different, and finding a breach is very different from fixing it and remediating it, right? You can also look at some of that content. You'll see a reasonable number of talks around how do you prioritize patches? What does that mean? Organizations today know that they need to patch their servers. They need to patch their software. But you can't possibly patch everything. So you have to triage. My assertion is that is completely broken. That is a completely broken world. And if you triage, if you make a mistake, the cost is extraordinarily high and, quite frankly, very hard to put a price on. So I assert that there's incremental feature failure in the industry today, but I think there's some hope. And so let's think about a scenario, right? What is it inside an organization that causes so much consternation? We can look at technology, we can look at features, we can say, well, this product has feature XYZ 1, 2, 3, this one has 4, 5, 6, 7, so therefore it's better. Feature comparisons are quite difficult in the security world. Instead, I'd say you need to think about the threat that you're worried about the most and then figure out how to mitigate it, right? And so another Spice Girls quote. I don't know what got into me, but that seemed like a good idea. Taking things inside the organization is actually quite easy today, right? A data breach and data loss, or the latest vogue, ransom, it's not that hard, right? You can go out and find toolkits to craft malware that will run inside the data center. It will hide in the network. These are not hard things to do, right? You can have a remote access tool that sits inside the network and does just about whatever you want. These things aren't terribly difficult to build. So what do we do? How do we try to deal with this? And I assert that one of the biggest things that keeps people awake at night in the organization, in the enterprise, is something called an advanced persistent threat. And the idea there is it worms its way into your data center, it sits latent or it hides, it collects information, and then does an exfiltration or does a ransom. Actually, we'll encrypt data and then say, give me a certain amount of money and I'll give you the key. Of course, that never really happens, right? That is the thing that people are most worried about. You can look at it. I don't want to end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal for the wrong thing. It's what worries most organizations today. It's something that worries me. You can look at the threat landscape. You can look at something like Norse Corp's maps, and you can actually see network traffic that is close to live that looks malicious. And it's just always happening. Go talk to an intelligence community. You can even see this stuff online, right? Or there's even television specials about it. There are people, like if you go to Google and you look at the security team, there is a huge spike of attacks that happen at 9 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning in another part of the world, and then they drop off at 6. It's literally people's jobs to go attack organizations. And in some cases, they're nation states. So what do? Right? Put a national filter on it. Put a worldwide filter on it. Highlight the importance of this. Has anybody heard of the Worldwide Threat Assessment? If you've seen one of my talks, you've seen this before. So the Director of National Intelligence in the US puts together every year a summary of the threats that face the nation, both physically and also economically. And you can look at these things online. This is a presentation that he does to Congress, to the Senate. Look at the arc of how it has changed from 2007 to 2015. In 2007, I don't think cyber warfare or cyber attacks were even on the list. You can imagine what's on the list. There's pestilence, there's nuclear proliferation, there's rogue states, all kinds of things like that obviously are on the list. Cyber warfare, not there. 2008, I think it was behind West African drug smuggling as a threat to the US. 2013, 14, and 15, the number one threat is cyber warfare. It's a big deal. So the Director of National Intelligence of the United States of America says that the number one threat physically and economically is cyber warfare. And if you read the 2015 report, it's not so much an Armageddon-style thing. It's more death by 1,000 paper cuts. And the 2015 report is particularly special. Here's the list, the table of contents from 2015. The 2015 report is particularly special in that on the first page of the report, they list private companies. As part of our worldwide threat assessment, we're listing private companies. Whoa, wait a minute. We're not talking about military bases. We're actually talking about the private sector is now a national risk. Arguably, it's a worldwide risk. Even though this is a US-centric report, I assert you can extrapolate it out to the rest of the world. The same thing is happening in other countries. The reason those two companies are listed is they suffered pretty traumatic breaches, and they list the amount of money that those companies had to spend to recover from those breaches, if you can actually recover. I live in San Francisco part-time, and every once in a while I decide to take the ferry to Sausalito. And I would say that the machines that issue tickets are pretty flaky. Watch the melee that happens when the credit card system doesn't work in those machines. It is like anarchy, right? If that kind of thing starts to happen en masse at anywhere in the world, prescriptions aren't available, et cetera, you can see a pretty traumatic effect that crosses, national boundaries. So my assertion is that today is a very special time because the things we're responsible for in our enterprises actually relate to more than just our shareholders. There's a bigger cause here. There's a bigger thing going on. It's an important topic. This is part of why I love what I do, right? I feel like I want to have an effect, an impact, a positive impact. Another Spice Girl quote. So tell me what you want, what you really, really want. These are the threats. What do you want to do about it? What is it that you want to build into your systems to deal with these kinds of threats? Are you going to be able to remove them entirely? No, probably not. There may always be bad guys. There may always be malicious employees. There may always be disgruntled partners that may be trying to get in. What is it that you really want? I assert you want systems that are resilient to attack, right? So you can imagine a system, you have a big attack coming at it, you don't want the system to fall over. You also don't want it to give up the keys to the kingdom. So the goal here is not the removal of threats, the goal is resilience against the threats. That's the goal. Now, some of you may have different goals or ideas about how you could actually mitigate these things, but I assert really you want something that'll give and pop back into form, pop back into shape. That's the goal. When I look at the breach reports from 2015, 2014, 2013, and previous, there are certain themes that run through attacks in organizations, right? It's really the only source of data that you can say this is definitive. So these are how the attacks happen. And I think there's three things. There may be more, but I think these three things are pretty pervasive. One of them is vulnerable and misconfigured software, right? You have a version of an operating system that has not been patched, and it has a vulnerable version of libxml. You're running a vulnerable version of OpenSSL that still has Heartbleed, right? There's lots of stuff that can happen with vulnerable and misconfigured software, and it's one of the ways that attackers get toeholds in your organization. because you can get malware that's crafted for a particular vulnerability. Has anybody tried to do this before? It's not that hard, right? So vulnerable or misconfigured software, number one. Number two, leaked credentials, right? I've devoted a part of my career to getting rid of passwords, and I failed miserably, right? So I have 300 and some odd passwords, and I have to have software to manage all the passwords that I use in different, websites and services and apps, right? Inside the data center, the problem is probably worse, right? It's at least just as bad. So the way systems communicate to one another, there's still passwords, there's still symmetric keys, there's still API keys, there's still TLS credentials, there's still tokens that need to be passed between systems. And when those things leak, disaster ensues. Make sense? So the question becomes, how do I deal with the inevitability of leaking these credentials? Because no matter how hard I try, it seems like they still leak. So you can try really hard to prevent these things from leaking, but you somehow have to deal with that inevitability. And then the third one is really important. It's kind of subtle, but it's time. Of course, in our universe, everything takes time, right? In this context, an attack needs a certain amount of time to mature. And the best metaphor that I can give here is, cancer doesn't kill the human body in a day or an hour or a minute. It happens as it spreads over time, right? And that's actually what gets you. Now, I don't assert that malware inside a data center takes as long as cancer, but there is an amount of time that malware has to mature inside the data center for it to really hurt you, right? To hurt the organization. These three things are the three-legged stool. These are the resources that malware requires to really do damage inside the organization. If you were to put this in terms of a plant, this is like, sunlight, water, and soil to a plant. You cut off one of those things, you have a very different perspective. And so I assert that the world today, inside the data center, if you were to use the plant metaphor, looks a lot like this Windows XP background. It's this pastoral scene. There's not too much sunlight. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. There's very clearly an abundant source of water. The soil is rich, and it's not changing. It sort of just stays like this. Does this hit a nerve with anybody? I go into organizations, weekly. Once they push something into production, you don't touch it. You leave it there. You leave it there. So to the malware author, this is like trying to get something to grow in this environment. It's not a level playing field, right? And so the question is, what do we do about it? Well, you kind of have an organizational problem that happens immediately, right? Security teams inside these companies are so used to having to deal with influxes of technology and oddball requests that there tends to be a culture of no, right? If you're fortunate enough to have, very good security people inside your organization, they may be really hard people to work with. They tend to be extremely hard to hire, right? They could be hard to sit in meetings with. Sometimes they do outbursts and things like that. I mean, I've worked with some really oddball kind of people. But they tend to say no as a default answer. That's kind of the default answer. And the reason is, if they say yes to everything, they'd completely lose control, right? So you tend to force things to be in known states, right, and exist for long periods of time. So you move slowly and you tend to be really cranky. So how do you overcome this sort of cultural problem as well? I don't have a universal answer for how to deal with culture, but I assert if you take a different view of the problem, it may not look as onerous as it does today, right? So I want to encourage us to think about this problem a little bit differently than we have been. And it's certainly different than what's going on at the conference, down the way. Step one, right? Patch everything. Immediately, quickly, frequently, as soon as it's out. Now, why don't people do this today? Think about it. An application stack, you've got your operating system, you've got a web server, you've got a runtime, you've got the application tier, you've got all kinds of stuff. You change one of those components, you don't know if the rest of the stack is going to work, right? So what do? You build these elaborate test matrices, you slow way down. I'm going to test, even though version 2.0 is out, I'm still testing 1.8. That gives the malware author lots of time, right? So one of the nice things about Cloud Foundry is it's a full stack solution, operating system, web server, runtime, et cetera. And we actually at Pivotal and in the foundation do a tremendous amount of testing so that when there is a vulnerability disclosed in the dependency chain, when it's patched, we test it so you can just push it. It's a big deal, right? Repair all of it frequently. Now, it's interesting, there are some banks that I've talked to, I don't know if this hits a nerve with you guys, that actually will not patch. We're not patching, they do something else to try to mitigate it because they don't know and they're not able to test all of the weird things that can happen if you push a patch into a data center, right? This stack becomes a real challenge to manage if you don't have a holistic platform. What they do instead is they'll rebuild a server from a known good state on an interval. Why is anybody doing that? Why would anybody go to that length? Because if you have malware that's sitting on there, it's gone. It disappears like a fart in a hurricane, right? Now what that does to the attacker is it says, I've got a shorter window of time that I can mount an attack, and then suddenly my remote access, for example, no longer works, and I've got to get in again. But if you're doing step one and you're patching frequently, the way that you got in might not work anymore. So there's an interesting relationship between repairing and repaving servers on an interval. When I worked at Microsoft, I was in the server and tools business, and that side of the massive company. And we used to take it personally that Unix servers and other servers would run for a lot longer without being rebooted than Windows Server would. Like, it was a problem. Like, we would catch hell about it. I assert that that world of saying, my server has been awake and not rebooted for 3 years is exactly the wrong model, right? We should think about things as saying, what's the minimum amount of time that I can have a server to live before it's repaved? I like that idea, right? Go talk to hackers about what that would do to the amount of time they have to mount an attack, and they'll be like, oh, it gets a little harder. It gets a lot harder. So repair and repave are linked, but really important concepts, right? And it turns out in Cloud Foundry, we have this command called bosh recreate that will build a VM from scratch, right? And you can do that without downtime inside your whole cluster. So if you have 250 VMs, you can run recreate on those things on an interval. Suddenly, you've now got some entropy inside your data center. Right? And then step 3, this is actually a really hard one. Rotate. Rotate the creds. I mentioned earlier that you can never really prevent credentials from leaking. So one of the protocols I worked on, I was an early contributor to, is OAuth 2. Everybody know what OAuth 2 is? I heard Dave mention it in the talk before this, right? So the idea is you acquire an access token, and you send that access token on to some resource server, right? That access token is a bearer token. So anyone that presents that access token has all the privilege that anyone else does that presents it. That's just kind of how the internet works, right? What that means is both parties have to have pristine management over that token. If it comes squirting out of either place, you got a problem, right? And if you're a client, you have no control over how the server's doing it. And if you're a server, you have no control over how the client's doing it. It's a real challenge. So one thing that's in OAuth 2 is you tend to have short lifetimes on tokens. Call it 20 minutes. Lifetime's always wrong. We don't do this inside the data center and other places, rotate credentials. We don't invalidate credentials at a fast enough pace. I assert this is something that we just need to do. It needs to be constant. If you look at the Swift attack, right, there was a partner, they ran off, I don't know, $81 million or something like that. There was a partner that their creds leaked. So they were able to use the network. That's a problem. Well, what if those credentials rotated faster? Might have actually helped the problem. So rotate credentials. I call these the 3 R's: repair, repave, and rotate. Now, you guys might be able to tell me that this is a stupid idea, it would not have any impact, but I've not heard that, and I've gone and shopped this, I've worked at this. We're trying to build this into Cloud Foundry as fast as we can, right? And I assert this is one of the things that can dramatically change the security posture of the data center. And the idea is simple. Culturally, it means instead of saying no, instead of slowing down, the way you get safer is by going faster. Go faster to be safer. And I assert if you do that, this pastoral landscape will be kind of harder to grow stuff in, right? Now, the naysayers will say, well, it's possible that Matt Damon would show up and use poop and rocket fuel to grow potatoes. There's still some possibility that that could happen. I'm not saying it's gone completely. What I am saying, though, is it gives you a lot of other stuff that you can think about, and it does change the security posture. And change is fundamentally hostile to malware if you do it in this way. So thank you guys for your attention. If you have any questions, comments, or personal attacks, I'll be happy to field them now. Make sense?